What if your house could get bigger in the summer and smaller in the winter, on purpose, at the push of a button? Not a metaphor, not a renovation. I mean the actual walls of the house physically sliding outward, doubling your living room in about 90 seconds, and then sliding back in before you tow the whole thing down the highway. This is real. It's being built and sold right now, in 2026, by more than one company. And once I started digging into how it actually works, I found something even more interesting than the party trick itself. A genuine engineering trade-off that decides whether this feature makes your tiny house dramatically better, or a maintenance headache waiting to happen 5 years down the road. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how these expanding tiny houses work, which companies are actually doing it well in 2026, and the one weatherproofing detail that separates a tiny house that lasts decades from one that starts leaking in its second winter. Stick around, because that last part is the difference between a smart investment and a very expensive mistake. Before we get into the mechanics, if clever, transforming small space design is your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because we've got more real builds like this coming every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. Alright, let's get into how a house actually changes size. Let's be precise about what we're actually talking about, because changes size every season sounds like it could mean a lot of different things, and I want to be honest with you about which version is real. There isn't, as far as I could find, a tiny house on the market in 2026 with some kind of automatic seasonal sensor that expands your house every June and shrinks it every December on its own. That specific idea, a fully automated seasonal system, doesn't exist yet as a real product. What does exist, and it's genuinely impressive, is the slide out. A slide out is a section of a tiny house, a wall, plus the floor and ceiling attached to it, that can physically extend outward once the house is parked, using either a manual crank or an electric motor, and then retract flush back into the main structure when it's time to hit the road. It's a trick borrowed directly from the RV industry, where slide-outs have been standard on larger motorhomes for years, and tiny house builders have spent the last decade adapting that same hardware to much smaller, much lighter structures. And here's where the seasonal framing actually becomes true, even without an automatic system. Owners of these homes genuinely do use the slide-outs on a seasonal rhythm. Extend everything out in spring when you're settling in for the warm months, and want the full living room, the full kitchen, the extra bedroom. Retract it all back down in fall or winter, either because you're relocating the house, storing it for a season, or simply because a smaller, more sealed footprint is easier and cheaper to heat once the temperature drops. So the size change isn't automatic, but it's real, it's dramatic, and plenty of owners really do treat it as a seasonal ritual. So who's actually building these? Let's go through some real, documented examples, because the range here is honestly wider than I expected. Start with a company called MagicBox Tiny House, which has developed a patented slide-out system they call the Magic Slide. Their standard version nearly doubles the entire footprint of the home, going from about 120 square feet all the way up to 230 square feet, and it does that transformation in under 2 minutes. They also offer a dual slide-out version, the Magic Slide 2X, which pushes total floor space up to around 460 square feet, which is genuinely approaching small studio apartment territory, all from a structure that's towable on a regular trailer. Then there's Rover Tiny Homes, whose model called the Cortez uses 3 separate slide-out sections at once, built on a triple-axle trailer, to create a home with 2 full bedrooms downstairs and a genuinely spacious living room, all while remaining road legal at 38 feet long when everything's tucked back in for travel. Zero Squared, a builder up in Canada, built a tiny house called the Aurora with what are reportedly some of the largest slide-outs seen yet on a home this size, all extending at the push of a button, turning a narrow, road-legal trailer into a home with real, walkable living space once it's parked. And one of the earlier, well-documented examples came from a company called Tiny Idahomes, which built a towable tiny house with 3 separate slide-out sections handling the dining room, the bedroom, and the lounge, all controlled with a simple push-button system, expanding the whole home to a maximum floor space of about 250 square feet once fully deployed. What's interesting is how consistent the core idea is across every single one of these builders, despite them working completely independently. Keep the house narrow and legal for towing, Then use motorized or manual slide-outs to reclaim all that lost with the moment you're parked and don't need to drive anywhere. On pricing, these aren't necessarily the budget end of the tiny house market, but they're also not out of reach the way you might expect. Some documented expandable models have listed in the high $60,000 range for a home with multiple push-button slide-outs, a full kitchen, and a real bathroom, genuinely comparable to a lot of fixed-layout tiny houses of similar quality. Once you factor in that you're basically getting a second, larger home folded inside a road-legal one. There's also a lesser-known variation worth mentioning, because it solves a completely different problem: the slide-up. Instead of extending outward for more floor width, a slide-up raises the roof itself, giving you more headroom in a section of the house that would otherwise force you to duck or crouch. One tiny house builder in Tennessee, Incredible Tiny Homes, experimented with exactly this as a proof of concept, and their first version added roughly 5 feet 10 inches of headroom to a section of the build. They've since talked about pushing that number even higher in future versions. It's a smaller, less flashy trick than a full slide out, but it points at the same underlying philosophy running through this entire category of tiny house design. If you can't make the house bigger everywhere at once and still keep it towable, figure out exactly which dimension matters most in a given room, and engineer a way to expand just that one dimension, only when you actually need it. Here's the actual engineering problem these slide-outs are solving, and it's worth understanding because it explains literally every design decision that follows. You can only make a tiny house so wide while keeping it legal to drive on public roads. Most regions cap standard towable widths at around 8.5 feet without needing special oversized permits. That's a hard ceiling. No amount of clever design gets around it if the house has to travel down a highway behind a truck. But 8.5 feet is genuinely narrow to live in full-time. A kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom, and a living space all crammed into that width starts to feel more like a hallway than a home. So slide-outs exist to solve exactly one problem. How do you get more livable width without breaking the legal towing limit? The answer is that the slide-out section only extends after the house has already arrived at its parking spot and disconnected from the tow vehicle. While the house is moving, everything's tucked in at the legal width. The moment it's parked, sections of wall, floor, and ceiling roll outward on tracks, sometimes manually cranked and sometimes driven by an electric motor, and suddenly a room that was 3 feet deep becomes 6 or 7 feet deep, roughly doubling the usable floor area of that specific room. A single slide-out typically adds somewhere between 40 and 100 square feet of genuinely usable space, which sounds modest until you remember the entire house might only be starting at 120 to 200 square feet total. That's not a small bump. That can be the difference between a couch that barely fits and an actual living room with a coffee table and walking space around it. It's also worth knowing there are 2 basic mechanism types you'll run into if you go shopping for one of these. Manual slide-outs use a hand crank or a simple lever system. Cheaper, fewer parts to fail, but more physical effort every single time you park or pack up. Electric slide-outs use a motor, usually paired with the house's existing battery or shore power, to extend and retract the whole section at the push of a button in under a couple of minutes. Electric systems are more convenient and honestly more impressive to show off, but they add another point of failure: a motor, a control board, wiring, that a manual system simply doesn't have. Some builders offer both, and plenty of buyers end up choosing manual specifically because it's one less thing that can break down in a remote location, far from a repair shop. Now here's the part one promise you at the top, because this is where the daydream meets reality, and where builders genuinely separate into did this right and did this wrong. Every single source I found on this topic, independently, flagged the exact same issue as the #1 risk with slide-out tiny homes: weatherproofing the seams. Every time a section of wall extends outward and then retracts back in, it has to seal against rain, wind, and swinging temperatures at the exact line where the moving section meets the fixed structure. That seam is doing double duty. It has to seal tight when the house is closed up and stationary, and it has to survive being compressed and released over and over every single time the slide-out moves for years. Get that wrong, and water finds its way in. Not dramatically, not all at once. It's usually a slow drip during heavy rain, or a bit of dampness that lingers after every retraction. And given enough seasons, that turns into rot, mold, or a genuinely expensive repair hiding inside a wall you can't easily access. Builders who take this seriously use marine-grade rubber gaskets and dual seal systems, specifically because standard silicone caulk is known to dry out and crack within about 2 seasons of that kind of repeated flexing, meaning a resealed with caulk slide-out isn't a one-time fix. It's a recurring maintenance chore. The builders getting this right are the ones spending real money on the sealing hardware most buyers never think to ask about, because it's invisible until it fails. There's a second, related warning worth passing along honestly. Trying to retrofit a slide-out onto a tiny house that wasn't originally engineered for one is considered one of the more common mistakes buyers and DIY builders make. The structural bracing, the ceiling geometry, and the weight distribution all have to be planned into the original design. Bolting a slide-out mechanism onto an existing fixed-wall tiny house after the fact tends to produce exactly the leaking, sagging problems that a properly engineered system avoids from day one. So given all that maintenance responsibility, why do buyers keep choosing slide-out models anyway? A couple of honest, practical reasons. First, obviously, is the livability itself. Going from a cramped corridor kitchen to something that genuinely feels like an open-concept living space the moment you're parked, without giving up the ability to legally tow the thing down the highway when you need to move. Second, and this one surprised me a little, resale value. Builders in this space report that slide-out models command higher prices on the secondary market, specifically because they appeal to a wider pool of future buyers. Someone who needs real living space might scroll right past a fixed 160 square foot floor plan, but stop and seriously consider a 160 square foot home that expands to 230 or more once it's parked. You're not just buying square footage, you're buying flexibility that a future buyer will also value, which tend to hold resale price up better than a fixed layout. And third, it genuinely does map onto how people actually live through the seasons, even without an automatic system doing it for them. Spring and summer tend to be when people want to entertain, spread out, and use every inch of the home. Late fall and winter tend to be when people scale back, spend more time in one cozy, well-heated core room, and might be storing or relocating the house anyway. A slide-out system happens to match that natural seasonal rhythm almost perfectly, even though nobody built an automatic seasonal timer to force it. There's a heating and cooling angle here too. Worth mentioning honestly, a fully extended tiny house, with every slide-out pushed out, has noticeably more exterior wall surface and more seams exposed to the weather than the same house buttoned up tight. In peak summer, that's rarely an issue. But in genuinely cold winter climates, some owners retract their slide-outs specifically to reduce the house's surface area and cut down on heat loss, effectively shrinking the home into a smaller, easier-to-heat core for the coldest months, then opening back up once the weather breaks. That's about as close as this technology gets to an actual seasonal size change routine. Not automatic, but a deliberate, practical habit plenty of owners settle into once they've lived through a full year in one of these homes. Before we wrap up, there's one more genuinely honest way that small homes change with the seasons, and it's been around far longer than any motorized slide-out: the convertible porch. A 3-season room is essentially a porch built with removable or slidable vinyl panels instead of permanent glass. In the warm months, you pull the panels out entirely, or leave just the screens in place, and you got an open-air, bug-free space to sit in. As the weather turns, you slide those same panels back into their tracks, and suddenly that same porch is sealed up enough to use comfortably into fall and early spring, without needing a furnace or serious insulation, because it's designed as a 3-season space rather than a true year-round room. Some builders push this even further with what's sometimes called a 4-season room. Genuinely insulated walls, energy-efficient windows, real heating and cooling built in, so the space works in every month of the year rather than just the mild ones. And on the lighter end, there are simple rolling vinyl window systems, sometimes with 2 or 3 overlapping panes, where you can remove the glass entirely for a full screen room feel in the hottest months, then slide the glass back into place the moment the temperature drops. Tiny house owners have absolutely borrowed this idea. Attach a small screen porch to a tiny house, and you've effectively added a seasonal room that costs a fraction of a motorized slide-out, doesn't need an electric motor or a marine-grade gasket system, and still gives you that genuine sense of a home that opens up in summer and closes back down in winter. It's a lower tech, lower cost answer to the exact same seasonal instinct. And honestly, for a lot of tiny house owners, it's the more practical one. So, does a tiny house really change size every season? Here's the honest, complete answer. There's no automatic system doing it on a calendar, but there is very real, very impressive engineering from builders like MagicBox, Rover, Zero Squared, and Tiny Idahomes that lets a house physically expand to the push of a button once it's parked and shrink back down the moment it needs to travel. Owners genuinely do use that flexibility on a seasonal rhythm, expanding for the warm months and pulling back in for winter, even if the house itself isn't the one deciding when to do it. The real story here isn't magic. It's smart engineering solving a genuinely hard problem. How to be narrow enough to legally drive and spacious enough to actually live in. And the honest trade-off is that it only works long-term if the weatherproofing is taken as seriously as the mechanism itself. If you want to see what it's actually like living day-to-day with one of these expanding homes, heating costs, how often the slide-outs actually get used, and what maintenance really looks like 5 years in, that's exactly what we're covering next. So stay subscribed and keep your notifications on. Thanks so much for sticking with me all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me honestly, would you want a house that expands and contracts, or does that just sound like one more mechanical thing that could eventually break? See you in the next one.